So, for the first three topics of Unit 1, we really focused on maps, the types of maps, what's wrong with maps, and how data is collected to put on those maps. But what we're going to look at really for the remainder of Unit 1, so starting with topic 4, is really kind of what these geographic principles look like in real life. So we've looked at maps, now we're going to kind of look at what they look like conceptually, so in the world, in action. So our first objective it's our only objective for topic 4, is to define major geographic concepts that illustrate spatial relationships. So we're going to look at various geographic concepts, so things in geography that show us relationships that can happen between two areas or multiple areas in space. All right. Now, we use that term space a lot in geography, and it seems very broad and weird because, you think like outer space, but all space is in geography is an area. It's a certain location. It's just an area. And so we look at it in geography just like in history class, you look at time, so when something happened. In geography, it's more where something happened. And so a quote that kind of frames that just says, historians look through the lens of time to understand the past. Geographers look through the lens of space to understand place. And so that's why we talk about space a lot in geography. We're not really looking at when something happened. We're looking at why something happened and where something happened. So to study this, to study to study space and figure out the relationships that different spaces have, we are going to look at 6 different spatial concepts: location, place, distance decay, time-space compression, diffusion, and pattern. All right. So location, and we're going to go into these in more detail, but location tells us where something is. Place tells us what it's like there. Distance decay and time-space compression tell us why it's like the way that it is. Diffusion tells us how it got there. So how did those certain features get there? And then we're going to look at, once we can see all of those different concepts, what patterns can be determined from looking at those concepts. So the first one that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on is location, because we really talked about this when we did the 5 themes of geography. So location can be absolute or relative. Absolute is specific according to a certain system. These coordinates that you see down here, that is absolute location. It's exact. Relative location is where something is depending on where something else is. It's in relation to another object or another place. So location, how do we describe where something is? Okay, I should have put an is right here. That is a typo, my bad. So how do we describe where something is location. Next, we're going to talk about place. So how do we describe what a location is like? That is place. So everywhere you go, mainly, is going to have a sense of place, okay? Factors that contribute to the uniqueness of a location. It's literally like the vibe you get when you go somewhere. And you can get that vibe from the human characteristics or the physical characteristics. So everywhere you go, the people there are going to have certain cultural characteristics. They may look a certain way. That's human characteristics. And then the environment there, it's going to be a certain. There's going to be certain physical characteristics that are different. So the temperature, the landforms there. That is going to be the physical characteristics of a place, and all of that contributes to how you feel when you go to that place. What you see, what you do is all part of the sense of place. You can also kind of gauge what a place is like based on its name. So a place name So the name of a place is called a toponym, and it's usually reflective of the culture or history of that place. When they're coming up for a name of a certain city, they usually use the sense of place to name that. A couple of examples: Washington, D.C. Obviously, it's named after George Washington. It's our political capital. It's very historic. You get that sense of place when you go there, if you've ever been, and you can gauge what that may be like based on what it's named: Washington. Salt Lake City is named after a physical characteristic. There is literally a salt lake in Utah, and so where people settled around it, they named it Salt Lake City. And those are just a couple of examples. There are tons of examples. You can literally be driving on the interstate and you can tell when you reach a city that was maybe founded by the Spanish, or maybe it was founded by Native Americans, because you can tell by the place name. But there can also be what's called placelessness, which is a location without a sense of place. Usually this is going to happen if somewhere is abandoned, but it's very rare that a place has no distinct attributes, but it is possible that there could be placelessness in a certain space. So we looked at location: how do we describe where something is? And we looked at place: how do we describe what a location is like? Um, What we are going to look at next, we're going to skip that map, don't worry about it. What we're going to look at next is why it is there or why it is not there. So why a place is like it is, or why is it not like this other place? Why are places different? That happens in two ways, or because of two things: distance decay and time-space compression. They're very similar, so pay close attention here. But distance decay says that the interaction between two places declines as the distance between two places increases. And here is a little chart that kind of illustrates that. It says that this is the level of interaction and this is the distance. Okay? As the further you get away from something, the less likely you are to interact with it. And the simplest way I can get you to think about this is really just to ask you, like, how far are you willing to walk somewhere before you're like, no, that's too far. Like, I'm not walking that far. I mean, are you willing to walk like half a mile, 2 miles before you're like, no, it's not worth it for me to go there? That's distance decay. So it really just says the further things are away from each other, the less likely they are to interact. And it seems like common sense, but a lot of geographic concepts are. It's something that happens and you don't really think about it, but it's a theory that the further things are away from each other, the less likely they are to interact. This can be caused by physical barriers. So if there is a mountain range in between two places, it's less likely that they are going to interact because, number one, like in the olden days, people aren't going to trek through mountains, they aren't going to walk. But two, it's even hard to kind of build roads on mountains. So that could be one. Rivers, ocean, deserts. So distance decay can be caused by physical barriers or cultural barriers. So language or religion can also cause two places to not interact as much. And then there is also time-space compression. So time-space compression says that the increasing sense of accessibility and connectivity, which seems to bring humans in distant places closer together. So time-space compression says that as technology, transportation, and communication evolves and gets better, the smaller the world seems. So this causes or is as a result of globalization, which is the intensified interaction among people, governments, and companies of different countries. And so I'm going to click on this to show you. But this is the times required to cross the Atlantic or orbit the Earth. between 1492 and 1962. And you can just kind of see how it takes less time um, because of different forms of technology. So, um, the airplane, it created a smaller world. The internet today created a smaller world. It's the increasing connectivity you feel with the rest of the world because of improvements in technology and stuff like that. So that's distance decay and time space compression. So that is gives us why something is there or why it is not there. Um, next, the next geographic concept we're going to look at tells us how it got there. All right. Um, and so that's called diffusion. And we're not going to get too into diffusion because we're going to cover that in another unit. But what it is just the process by which a characteristic spreads across space from one place to another. And so there are things like relocation diffusion, there's contagious diffusion, there's hierarchical diffusion. But it is how something gets from one place to another. So certain cultural attributes or something like that. But it's important to note that when talking about distance decay, time space compression, and diffusion together, that with distance decay, the likelihood of diffusion, so the spread of characteristics, so the likelihood of the spread of characteristics with distance decay as time, I'm so sorry. I'm so tired. Let me start over because I don't want to restart this video. With distance decay, the likelihood of diffusion decreases as time and distance from the hearth increases. So the hearth is just a cultural center. So diffusion is going to decrease as you get further and further away from that cultural hearth. Because distance decay says that the further something is away, the less likely you are to interact with it. But time-space compression says that the likelihood of diffusion depends on the connectedness among places. And so this theory says that it's not necessarily distance, but it's how connected you are to those places. For example, the United States feels closer to Europe than, let's say, Africa, because we speak the same language and our culture is more similar. Whereas the actual distance may not be that different. There are more barriers, like cultural barriers to that. So we feel closer and more connected to Europe. We also have more business interest in Europe. We don't really have a lot of companies in Africa, but we probably do in Europe. And so that kind of follows the theory of time space compression, that the likelihood of diffusion depends on the connectedness among those places, not necessarily distance. And the last thing we're going to look at is what patterns you may be able to see because of such geographic spatial concepts. So when looking at those things in real life and on a map, you may be able to see clustering. So you're going to look at the density of something, how close they are together, the number of something in a certain area. You may be able to see how far apart something is. That is dispersal and distribution. So the way something is spread out over an area. And then you may be able to look at both of those things and see how they are related, associated, or correlated with one another. So you're looking at those relationships. So you can literally take where something is, what it's like, why it's there, how it got there, and determine if there are any relationships among other phenomena. And that's really what studying these geographic concepts tells us. Is any of it related? And so make sure you have all these notes for topic 4. I know this is a little bit different than we have been doing. It's not in the Google form, but I'm teaching this in class because Hurricane Laura kind of messed up. So I just had to make a quick video for you guys. Please schedule a meeting with me if you're confused about something, because your unit test is probably going to be on September 11th, which is coming up. So don't be confused. Let me know if you have any questions.